the night Oliver Stern brought his girlfriend into their home and told Vivian to get out. He had no idea he was standing in a house that had never belonged to him. It was a Thursday in late November, the kind of night that arrives in Ottawa with a particular cruelty. The temperature already well below zero, the wind off the river, slicing through anything less than a proper coat. Vivian Stern had been in her home office when she heard the front door open. She heard two voices. She recognized one. The other was younger, higher in pitch, and far too comfortable. She came downstairs in her wool socks and reading glasses, a folder of quarterly reports still in her hand, and found Oliver standing in the foyer with a woman Vivian had seen exactly once before. In a photo on Oliver's phone that he hadn't known she'd seen. The woman's name was Tara. She was 31. She sold luxury real estate in Westboro, and apparently had no particular problem walking into another woman's home like she owned it. "I was going to call you," Oliver said, which was not an apology. Vivian looked at Tara. Tara looked back at Vivian with the specific kind of confidence that comes from never having been truly embarrassed. She had a bag over her shoulder, not an overnight bag. Something larger. "We need to talk," Oliver said. They talked in the kitchen, or rather Oliver talked, and Vivian stood near the counter and listened. He said he should have told her sooner. He said things between them had been over for a long time, which was partially true. He said he hoped they could be adults about this. He said, and this was the part Vivian would remember longest, that since the house was in his name, it would be easier if she were the one to leave. "Tonight," he added. "I think it's better if it's tonight." Vivian set her folder on the counter. She removed her reading glasses and folded them carefully. "The house is in your name," she said. "Yes, and you'd like me out tonight. I know it's a lot to ask, but Tara is— I heard you the first time." What Oliver did not know, what he had never asked about, never bothered to understand, was that Oliver's name was on the deed because Vivian had put it there. 3 years earlier, during a tax restructuring her accountant had recommended, Vivian had transferred the Rockcliffe Park property into a holding company. That holding company was registered to Oliver's name as a nominee, a legal formality her lawyer had suggested. For reasons Oliver never fully grasped because he had not been present at the meeting and had signed the documents she'd set in front of him without reading them. He thought he owned the house. He had always thought he owned the house. It was one of the more expensive misunderstandings of his life. But Vivian did not say any of this. "Not yet," she said. "Give me an hour." She went upstairs. She did not pack. She sat on the edge of the bed they had shared for 11 years, and she called her lawyer, a woman named Patricia. No, someone else. Her lawyer was a woman named Rosalind Fair, who had been her lawyer since before Oliver was her husband, and who answered on the second ring, despite it being 9:40 on a Thursday evening. "He's asked me to leave the house," Vivian said. There was a brief pause on Rosalind's end. "The Rockcliffe property." "Yes, and he believes he owns it outright." "He does believe that." Another pause, this one with a slightly different quality to it, the kind of pause that precedes a response a lawyer enjoys giving. "Do not leave that house," Rosalind said, "and don't touch anything. I'll make some calls." Vivian changed into warmer clothes. She went downstairs. Oliver and Tara were in the living room, and Tara had opened a bottle of wine from Vivian's collection. A 2017 Burgundy Vivian had been saving, and they were sitting together on the sofa as though she were already gone. "I need more time," Vivian said. Oliver frowned. "Vivian," I said, "I need more time." She went to the kitchen and made herself tea. She sat at the kitchen island, the same island where she had eaten breakfast for 11 years, and she was quiet, and she waited. What most people did not know about Vivian Stern was that her name before Oliver was Vivian Aldcroft, and that the Aldcroft name in Ottawa carried a weight that most people her age had spent their lives trying to escape or exploit. Her grandfather had built Aldcroft Construction from a 2-truck operation in the 1960s into one of the largest private infrastructure firms in eastern Ontario. By the time the company passed to her father, it employed over 3,000 people. By the time Vivian took over its holding entity at 42, quietly, through a series of restructurings her father's estate lawyer had orchestrated, it had evolved into something considerably more complex and considerably less visible. Vivian did not talk about this at dinner parties. She did not correct people who assumed Oliver, who worked in commercial real estate development, was the primary earner. She had learned, over a long and occasionally painful education, that being underestimated was one of the more useful positions a woman could occupy. Oliver had known she came from money. He had not known how much money, or where it was, or who exactly controlled it. He knew she had a portfolio. He knew she had meetings she didn't always explain. He had learned not to ask too many questions, because the answers were usually technical, and he found finance tedious. This was, in retrospect, a significant oversight on his part. They had met at a fundraiser for the Ottawa Hospital Foundation. He was charming. He was good-looking in the way that wears well at 40. Broad-shouldered, dark-haired, comfortable in a room. He made her laugh 3 times in one evening, which was more than most people managed in a month. She was lonely in the particular way that successful women sometimes are, the kind of loneliness that accumulates slowly without you noticing until one day it's just there, a constant low hum behind everything else. She had loved him. That was the honest truth of it, and she held on to the honesty of it even now. Even standing in her own kitchen making tea, while his girlfriend sat in her living room drinking her wine. She had loved him, and she had built a life around that. And somewhere in the last few years, that life had quietly hollowed out without either of them doing anything about it. But loving someone and accepting what he had done tonight were 2 entirely separate things. At 11:15, Oliver appeared in the kitchen doorway. "I think you've had enough time," he said. "I'm not leaving." He stared at her. Oliver was not a man accustomed to being told no directly. He negotiated for a living, which meant he was skilled at making no feel like an unreasonable position. "Vivian, the house—" "Sit down, Oliver." "I'm not going to." "Sit down." Something in her voice, she was not angry, which was the thing that made people listen, made him pause. He pulled out a stool and sat. She set her mug down. She looked at him directly, the way she looked at people in boardrooms when she wanted them to understand that whatever they thought was about to happen was not what was about to happen. "You believe this house is yours," she said. "It's in my name. It's in your name as a nominee for Aldcroft Holdings Incorporated, which is wholly owned by me. You signed the nominee agreement 3 years ago in March. You signed it in my lawyer's office. You were there for 11 minutes, and you left early because you had lunch with a client." Oliver said nothing. "The property itself is held by a subsidiary trust that my grandfather established in 1987. I am the sole beneficiary. You have never had an ownership interest in this house, in any legal sense, at any point in our marriage." Tara had appeared in the doorway now. She was holding the wine glass. "What is she talking about?" Tara said. Oliver looked at Vivian. His expression had gone through several stages. Disbelief, recalculation, something close to fear, and had settled somewhere Vivian didn't have a name for. "This isn't. My lawyer will be sending paperwork to your phone within the hour," Vivian said. "You're welcome to have your own lawyer review it. I'd recommend you do. There are a few other things you'll want to be aware of. The car, for instance, which is registered to the same holding company, and the Tremblant property, and your office lease on Spark Street, which goes through a company you've never asked me about." The silence in the kitchen was very thorough. "The Spark Street lease," Oliver repeated. "Your firm's office lease. Aldcroft Holdings has owned that building since 2009. I inherited it. Your firm pays rent to a management company that reports to me. I've never mentioned it because it never came up." Tara set her wine glass on the counter. She looked at Oliver. The expression on her face was one Vivian recognized. It was the expression of someone rapidly recalculating whether a situation was worth what they had previously thought it was worth. "Oliver," Tara said. "Don't," he said. Rosalind Fair arrived at midnight, which was the kind of commitment that warranted an excellent hourly rate, and Vivian paid it without complaint. She was 53, small with close-cropped gray hair, and the demeanor of someone who had spent 3 decades in rooms where men underestimated her and had learned to find it relaxing. She brought 2 associates. She brought documents. She sat across from Oliver at the kitchen table, and she walked him, methodically, and without any particular emotion, through the structure of his situation. Oliver had a lawyer. His name was Greg. He was a friend from university. He did mostly residential closings, and Rosalind suggested he call Greg immediately, which Oliver did. And Greg arrived 40 minutes later, looking like he had dressed in his car, which he had. Greg sat down, looked at the documents, and asked for 20 minutes to review them privately with his client. Vivian made more tea. She sat in the dining room. Through the wall she could hear Oliver's voice and Greg's voice in a conversation that, from the cadence of it, was going in one consistent direction. Tara had left at 12:40. She had picked up her bag from the foyer, not her wine glass, and she had walked out without saying anything. Vivian heard the front door close. She heard a car start in the driveway. She heard it back out and drive away, and she did not watch it go. At 1:15, Greg came out of the kitchen. He looked at Vivian with the expression of a man who wished he were somewhere else. "Mrs. Stern," he said, "my client would like to discuss next steps." "Of course," Vivian said. She went into the kitchen. Oliver was sitting at the table. He looked smaller than he had an hour ago, which was something Vivian had noticed before in other contexts. The way people physically contracted when the thing they had built their confidence on turned out to be different from what they'd assumed. "I didn't know," he said, which may or may not have been true. "About the lease, about the structure. I know you didn't. That's not." He stopped. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" This was the question she had been waiting for, and she had thought about the answer, and she gave it honestly. "Because you never asked. In 11 years, you never once asked me how the money worked. You asked about vacations and restaurants and whether we should renovate the kitchen. You did not ask about the structures. I assumed you understood them." She paused. "I probably shouldn't have assumed." Oliver looked at his hands. Greg looked at his notes. "What happens now?" Oliver said. "That depends entirely on how you'd like to proceed," Rosalind said. "My client is prepared to be reasonable, but reasonable began at 11 years of marriage and has since been adjusted for tonight." What happened over the following weeks was not dramatic, at least not in the way that things are dramatic when they happen in films or in the kind of stories people tell at dinner parties. It was the drama of paperwork, of phone calls, of a man slowly understanding the dimensions of the world he had actually been living in, rather than the one he believed he'd been living in. Oliver vacated the Rockcliffe house within 10 days. Rosalind handled the separation agreement. There were negotiations. Greg tried several approaches, all of which Rosalind had anticipated, which is the advantage of having a lawyer who has been doing this for 30 years and has no patience for delay. The Spark Street building was a particular point of discussion. Oliver's firm had 3 years left on their lease. This was not an immediate problem. Vivian had no intention of disrupting a business over a personal matter, which she told Rosalind to communicate clearly, because she was not cruel, and she understood the difference between consequence and cruelty. But it meant that Oliver arrived at his office every morning and sat in a space that was, in ways he had not previously known, hers. She heard from a mutual acquaintance that he had told people the split was mutual. She did not correct this. She heard that he and Tara had ended things within 3 weeks, which surprised her slightly. She had expected it to last longer, and she felt, when she heard this, not satisfaction exactly, but a kind of recognition. Something returning to its natural state. Her daughter, Brooke. Vivian and Oliver had no children together, but Vivian had a daughter from her first marriage, who was 23 and studying architecture in Montreal, called her on a Sunday morning in December. "Mom," Brooke said, "I heard about Dad Oliver. He's not your dad, sweetheart." "I know, but I've been calling him that since I was 12. "Fair enough. Are you okay?" Vivian thought about this. She was standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the back garden, which in November is just dead grass and bare maples, and the remnants of what had been, in summer, a reasonably good herb garden. It looked stark, but it was also honest. Things without their cover tend to look like what they are. "I think so," she said. "I think I've been getting ready for this for a while and didn't realize it." "Did you make him cry?" "Brooke, did you?" "I did not make him cry. I had Rosalind explain some legal documents to him." Brooke laughed. It was a good sound, warm and clear, across 400 kilometers of winter. "Same thing," she said. Tara had sent Oliver a series of messages. Vivian would never read them, but she knew from the timeline of events that Tara had messaged him within 2 hours of leaving the house that night. She had apparently expected the evening to resolve differently. She had apparently expected to be waking up the next morning, in a house in Rockcliffe Park. What she had woken up to instead was a sublet in Hintonburg, and the knowledge that the man she had chosen had not been who she had believed him to be. Vivian was not a woman who took pleasure in other people's suffering, but she also understood that choices carry weight, and that the weight does not disappear simply because you've decided not to think about it. Tara had known Oliver was married. She had known it and chosen anyway, and the choosing had seemed worth it, as long as the version of Oliver she was choosing was the version she thought existed, the one with the house in Rockcliffe, and the firm on Spark Street, and the general air of someone whose life was working out. What she had not counted on was that the life was someone else's. This was, Vivian thought, the thing people rarely understood about the kind of marriage Oliver had assumed he was in. They assumed the woman keeping the house and keeping the schedule, and keeping the whole quiet machinery of the life running was passive, was background, was the fixed point around which other things moved. They did not ask who held the documents. They did not wonder who signed what and why. They found out eventually. That was the thing. They always found out eventually. In January, Vivian accepted an invitation to sit on the board of a new community foundation being established out of the University of Ottawa. It was something she had considered for years and put off, the way you put off things that require you to have space in your life for something new. She had space now. She also, in January, had the kitchen renovated. Not because it needed it. It was a good kitchen, practically new. But because she had thought about renovating it for 4 years, and Oliver had always found a reason to wait. She chose everything herself. She got rid of the marble Oliver had insisted on and put in a butcher block counter she had always liked better. Small things, but they were hers. Brooke came home for the long weekend in February and stood in the new kitchen and said, "It looks like you." And Vivian made coffee, and they sat at the island and talked for 4 hours about Brooke's thesis, and the firm in Toronto Brooke was hoping to do a placement with, and a person Brooke had been seeing who she was cautiously optimistic about. Vivian listened. She had always been good at listening. It was one of the things, honestly, that had made her good at business. People tell you things when they feel listened to. They tell you more than they mean to. They tell you everything, eventually. She thought about Oliver, sitting in that kitchen in November, being told the shape of things he'd always assumed were different. She thought about the look on his face, not cruel about it. She genuinely was not a cruel person, but honest. When Rosalind had walked him through the documents, there was something clarifying in it. Not for him. For her. She had spent 11 years being the person in the background, keeping things running, keeping things quiet, making space for someone who had never really looked at what the space was made of. She didn't regret the years. That would be too simple, and it would be inaccurate. There had been good years. There had been real ones. But there comes a point. She thought she'd read this somewhere once. Or maybe her grandmother had said it. There comes a point where staying in the background is no longer modesty. It becomes erasure. And the only person who can walk yourself back into the room is you. The following spring, Aldcroft Holdings underwent a formal rebranding. One Vivian had been planning for 18 months. It was not a dramatic rebranding. It retained the family name. But it added, for the first time in its 60-year history, a public-facing profile, a website, a brief written history, a photograph of the current principal on the landing page. It was not a large photograph. It was tasteful, in the way that things are tasteful when they are done with intention rather than effort, but it was there. Rosalind called her the morning the site went live. "I just saw the website," she said, "and you look good." "Thank you, Rosalind. Are you ready for what comes with this?" Vivian looked out her kitchen window at the back garden. It was April now. Things were coming back. The maples were starting, just barely, and the patch where she'd pulled out the herb garden and put in something more permanent. Lavender, which overwinters, which survives, was showing green. "Yes," she said. "I think I've been ready for a while." She hung up, finished her coffee, and went to work.